You walk into a meeting already knowing where things can go wrong. You see the risk, the timing, the consequence 2 steps ahead. You try to explain it calmly, but someone else speaks louder, simpler, more confident, and suddenly the room follows feeling instead of foresight. At home, it is the same pattern. You explain a situation carefully, layer by layer, and later they repeat only the part that makes them comfortable, ignoring the warning that actually mattered. Online, it is worse. You lay out a clear argument, and people do not answer it. They react. They attack a tone, a word, an emotion you never intended. Over time, something changes inside you. You either start talking less, conserving energy, choosing silence over friction, or you talk more, over-explaining, adding examples, softening edges, hoping clarity will finally land. It rarely does. And the exhaustion is not loud. It is quiet. It feels like carrying weight that nobody else notices. You start wondering if the problem is you. Maybe you are explaining it wrong. Maybe you are too intense. Maybe you should simplify even more. But a deeper question keeps surfacing, one you try not to say out loud. What if this is not a communication issue at all? What if you are playing a game where the rules are not shared, where logic is optional, confidence is rewarded, and emotional certainty beats careful thinking every time? That realization is uncomfortable because it means your intelligence is not failing you. It is costing you. The problem is not that you are unclear. The problem is that you are speaking to the wrong level of reality. And until you recognize that mismatch, every conversation will drain you, confuse you, and quietly teach you to doubt instincts that were never wrong before now. Before anything else, you must drop the fantasy that the world is driven by reason. That fantasy is what has been exhausting you. This is where Machiavelli matters, not as a figure to admire, but as a lens that cuts through comfort. He never wasted time asking who was right, fair, or well-intentioned, because those questions collapse under pressure. He watched what actually happened when tension entered a room. Who gained ground? Who lost it? Who adapted, and who kept explaining while power moved elsewhere? Machiavelli understood people do not operate on logic first. They operate on fear, desire, status, and advantage. Then decorate those impulses with language that sounds reasonable. That insight is the foundation of this video. This is not about debating better, persuading harder, or finding perfect words that make everyone understand you. That hope has been draining you all along. This is not about fixing others or dragging them up to your level of thinking. That impulse feels noble, but it is strategically suicidal. The goal is simpler and far more useful. Stop wasting energy in environments that do not reward clarity. Recognize when explanation lowers your position instead of strengthening it. Nothing more here. What most people call thinking is just emotional defense dressed as logic. From a Machiavellian view, this is not an insult, but a survival pattern. Humans act first to protect advantage, safety, and status, then search for reasons that justify those actions. Real thinking is slower. It tolerates uncertainty, traces consequences, and accepts that a comfortable belief might be wrong. Reaction is easier. Reaction shields the ego. You see it as soon as pressure appears. In discussions, people choose sides before hearing arguments because belonging feels safer than doubt. In meetings, the loudest voice wins, not because it is correct, but because confidence calms anxiety. Online, this intensifies. Clear analysis loses to sharp emotion because emotion spreads faster than understanding. Machiavelli saw this long before psychology named it. By watching courts, crowds, and leaders, he reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Most people are not seeking truth. They seek stability. Truth is welcome only when it does not threaten position, identity, or belonging. When it does, it becomes dangerous. Facts fail to land because accepting them requires admitting past error, and that feels like loss. So beliefs are defended not for accuracy, but familiarity. This is where intelligent people suffer. They speak about outcomes and long-term effects, while others protect how they feel now. The friction feels personal, but it is structural. You offer analysis to someone guarding control. From a Machiavellian lens, the mistake is expectation. Expecting logic where self-preservation rules is like expecting honesty in leverage-based negotiation. Once you see this, irritation becomes clarity. Resistance is no longer communication failure, but cost calculation. Understanding is accepted only when it benefits the listener. When it threatens status, comfort, or certainty, it is rejected. The question shifts from why they do not understand to what understanding would cost them. Once you see that most people react to protect themselves, the next truth becomes uncomfortable. Many people do not fail to understand because they lack intelligence. They refuse to understand because understanding would cost them position. To understand means admitting something must change, and change is dangerous when status depends on things staying the same. In companies, this appears when a manager with weak skills shuts down better ideas, not through logic, but authority. Insight threatens the role they occupy, so it is labeled impractical or negative. In friend groups, the person who names the obvious problem becomes intense or complicated, while others bond by pretending nothing is wrong. In families, the one who points out harmful patterns is called difficult, dramatic, or disrespectful. The label is never about truth. It is about containment. From a Machiavellian perspective, this behavior is rational. People defend position before reality. You are not having dialogue in these moments. You are triggering survival. Your clarity destabilizes the psychological order they rely on to feel safe. That is why resistance feels emotional instead of logical. You are not being disagreed with. You are being neutralized. This is also why pushing harder backfires. The clearer you expose the issue, the more forcefully defenses rise. They are not weighing arguments. They are guarding identity. Machiavelli understood power rests on perception, not truth. And when truth threatens perception, perception fights back. This is where intelligent people waste years of energy. They assume misunderstanding is accidental, so they keep explaining. They assume denial is ignorance, so they keep adding evidence. What they are really doing is escalating threat. Accepting your point would require stepping down, admitting error, surrendering comfort. Most people would rather label you the problem than pay that price. This realization is sharp but freeing. When you stop, the shock is not that they are wrong. It is how little doubt they carry while being wrong. You watch someone state something flawed with absolute certainty, and the room responds as if confidence itself were proof. From a Machiavellian angle, this is not accidental. It is a social advantage. Certainty projects control, and control calms people who do not want to think deeply. Doubt, on the other hand, even when intelligent, signals risk. The person who pauses, qualifies, or considers nuance appears weaker than the person who declares and moves on. That is why those with shallow understanding often rise faster in visible hierarchies. In the workplace, this dynamic is painfully familiar. A manager who lacks depth makes decisive calls, cuts off discussion, labels caution as negativity, and frames speed as leadership. They are followed not because they are right, but because they appear unshaken. Meanwhile, the person who sees the downstream consequences is asked to explain again simplify further, or align with the direction, until their insight loses urgency and power. Outside of work, the same mechanism plays out quietly. In social settings, the person who speaks loudest anchors the group's opinion. In arguments, the one who refuses to question themselves feels dominant, even when facts disagree. Machiavelli observed that people rarely follow truth in isolation. They follow signals that suggest safety, strength, and certainty. Confidence tells the group someone is in control. Hesitation suggests instability. That is why engaging with confident ignorance feels so draining. You bring evidence, they bring repetition. You bring logic, they bring tone. You show inconsistency, they ignore it and restate their position without blinking. Not because they have resolved the contradiction, but because the goal was never resolution. The goal was to hold ground. This is where intelligent people miscalculate. They assume discussion is about accuracy, so they enter armed with facts, believing truth will correct perception. But perception is already decided. The other person is not defending an idea, they are defending their authority. Each time you argue, you elevate their certainty by treating it as something worth refuting. To observers, engagement looks like legitimacy. Confidence plus attention becomes dominance. Machiavelli would call this a strategic error. He would tell you that not every position deserves resistance. Some positions gain power precisely because they are challenged. The lesson here is not to become louder or more aggressive. It is to understand the terrain you are standing on. Social systems do not reward being right. They reward appearing in control. When you try to defeat hollow certainty with careful reasoning, you fight uphill in the wrong arena. The smarter move is disengagement. Remove the oxygen. Let confidence echo without opposition until its emptiness becomes obvious to those capable of seeing it. This is uncomfortable because it violates a belief many intelligent people hold: that truth should stand on its own, that correctness should rise naturally. But reality does not work that way. In society, certainty often outruns competence, and confidence frequently beats accuracy. Once you accept this, you stop draining yourself, trying to win debates that were never about truth. You start choosing where your voice matters and where silence protects your position. That shift is not weakness. It is strategy. In society, certainty often wins over correctness. If you've ever been ignored while being right, comment, "I see the game." When individuals merge into a group, something subtle but decisive breaks. Thought thins out, emotion thickens, and logic quietly loses its leverage. Machiavellian realism starts here, not with contempt, but with observation. A crowd does not reason step by step, it synchronizes feeling. Anxiety jumps from person to person. Excitement amplifies itself. Anger finds allies instantly. This is why facts feel weak in public spaces, not because they are false, but because they are slow. Look at modern media and the pattern is obvious. Headlines are crafted to provoke a reaction before the mind has time to ask the questions. Fear keeps eyes locked. Outrage keeps fingers clicking. Calm explanation disappears because it does not spread. In politics, the same mechanism governs outcomes. Voters respond to tone, posture, and emotional narrative long before they examine policy. The figure who makes people feel threatened or protected dominates attention, even if their arguments collapse under scrutiny. In corporate culture, the process is quieter, but just as real. Meetings reward emotional alignment, not foresight. The person who mirrors leadership's mood is seen as cooperative, while the one who introduces uncomfortable logic is labeled negative, difficult, or not a cultural fit. Machiavelli saw this centuries ago. He understood that groups are not interested in what is correct. They are interested in what stabilizes their sense of identity and direction. Rational thought survives in crowds only under specific conditions, when it is enforced by authority or when it clearly benefits the listener's position. Outside of power or incentive, logic floats past without landing. This is where many intelligent people misread the situation. They bring careful analysis into environments fueled by emotion and expect recognition. Instead, they experience silence or resistance and assume they failed. They didn't. They misjudged the operating system. A crowd is not a bigger version of a single mind. It is a different organism entirely. It responds to rhythm, repetition, and feeling, not nuance. When you argue logically with a group, you are not entering a debate. You are interrupting an emotional current. That is why it feels like shouting into wind. Machiavelli never believed crowds could be persuaded by truth alone. He believed they could be directed by emotion and shaped by interest. This is not manipulation. It is clarity. Once you see this, something releases. You stop taking group reactions personally. You stop wasting energy trying to be understood in spaces designed to reward conformity. You reserve logic for decision-making, for private influence, for moments where leverage exists. And you stop confusing being ignored with being wrong. The crowd is not rejecting your truth. It is simply not built to receive it. You do not convince masses with facts. You move them with emotion. And when you finally accept that rule, you stop fighting the current and start choosing where your clarity actually belongs. Well, once you understand how emotion drives crowds, a more personal trap reveals itself, and it is far more dangerous. You start trying to earn understanding. Intelligent people fall into this quietly. When someone looks confused, you explain. When they resist, you soften. When they push back, you add context, examples, nuance, hoping clarity will fix the tension. It feels responsible, even respectful. But this is where position begins to erode. Niccolo Machiavelli would see this not as humility, but as self-weakening. In social systems, explanation is rarely neutral. Every time you explain yourself, you signal that your stance is open for evaluation. Every time you justify, you invite judgment. Over time, people learn something subtle about you. They learn you can be negotiated with. They learn you will bend to be accepted. You can see this pattern everywhere. The colleague who constantly explains their decisions becomes the one everyone feels entitled to challenge. Meetings drag because their clarity creates debate instead of resolution. Meanwhile, the person who states a direction without apology is rarely asked to defend it, even when it is flawed. In friendships, the person who explains their boundaries ends up re-explaining them again and again, while the one who simply enforces them is respected, sometimes resented, but never ignored. The painful part is that intelligence makes this worse, not better. You are good at articulating, so you keep doing it. You believe better language will fix misalignment. You believe if they truly understood, things would change. But Machiavellian reality is colder. Understanding does not create respect. Position does. The more you explain in the wrong environment, the smaller you appear. Not because your ideas lack value, but because you are trading authority for approval. And approval is a losing currency. The room does not reward depth, it rewards certainty. It does not elevate those who clarify, it elevates those who conclude. This is why intelligent people often feel invisible. They keep giving away insight to spaces that cannot recognize it, and each attempt makes them feel less solid. Over time, this breeds resentment. You feel overlooked, undervalued, passed over. Not because you lack capability, but because you keep trying to be understood by people who only respect finality. Machiavelli's correction is sharp. Stop performing your intelligence. Stop translating yourself downward to earn comfort. This does not mean becoming arrogant or cruel. It means becoming selective. It means recognizing that not every room deserves your reasoning. Some rooms only respond to outcomes. When you stop explaining reflexively, something shifts. Silence gains weight. Statements land cleaner. Your words stop sounding like invitations and start sounding like positions. People may not agree with you, but they account for you. That is the difference. Power is not about being liked. It is about being factored in. Those with position rarely feel the need to explain themselves fully, because explanation lowers their leverage. They let uncertainty work in their favor. Intelligent people resist this because it feels like withholding, like manipulation, like playing games. But it is neither. It is alignment with reality. You are not hiding truth. You are protecting it from environments that would cheapen it. The cost of over-explaining is not just exhaustion, it is loss of stature. Each justification makes you smaller. Each clarification invites comparison. Each attempt to be understood risks turning your clarity into background noise. The moment you feel the urge to explain yourself, pause and ask what you are really trying to secure. Understanding or acceptance? Most of the time, it is acceptance. And acceptance is the most expensive thing you can give away. The people who matter do not need your full reasoning. They can infer. The people who demand it will never value it. This is the line Machiavelli would draw. Those with position do not need to be understood. They need to be considered. And when you stop shrinking yourself to be clear, you feel something solid replace the tension. Relief. Not because people finally get you, but because you are no longer negotiating your worth sentence by sentence. If you've ever felt smaller after explaining yourself, comment, "Enough." The moment you stop explaining yourself, the consequences do not show up as applause or agreement. They show up as distance. That shift is the natural continuation of what came before. Because when you no longer chase understanding, you no longer blend into the crowd. The first sign is not loneliness, it is silence. The kind that arrives without confrontation, without drama, without anyone saying goodbye. Conversations slow down. Invitations thin out. The room stops adjusting itself around your reactions. And if you are not prepared for it, this silence feels like rejection. But it is not. It is separation forming once you stop performing for acceptance. When you see clearly, alignment becomes rare. You no longer nod automatically. You no longer laugh on cue. You no longer agree just to stay included. And people sense that immediately, not consciously, not maliciously, but instinctively. Most social bonds survive through shared assumptions and emotional shortcuts. They exist because everyone quietly agrees not to look too closely. The moment you start noticing incentives, contradictions, and power dynamics beneath the surface, your rhythm changes. You speak less. You react slower. You choose more carefully. And the crowd, which depends on sameness, begins to drift away. At work, this shows up quietly. Meetings feel repetitive. Enthusiasm feels staged. You watch the same confident decisions lead to the same poor outcomes, and you stop clapping for momentum that goes nowhere. You are no longer rewarded for emotional alignment, so you become less visible. In social circles, the effect is similar. Conversations loop around familiar complaints and recycled opinions, and you realize you are no longer entertained by stories that never resolve. You see where things are heading before others want to admit it. And even when you keep that insight to yourself, the restraint alone creates distance. This is not because you are better than anyone. It is because innocence plays a role in belonging. And once innocence is gone, effortless connection disappears with it. Machiavellian realism never promises popularity. It promises accuracy. And accuracy comes with a cost. The clearer you see how people operate, the harder it becomes to participate without friction. This is where many intelligent people retreat. They soften their edges again. They explain more. They laugh louder. They pretend not to notice what they now understand too well. They trade awareness for comfort because comfort feels safer than standing apart. But that trade is expensive. Each step back into the crowd dulls perception. Each attempt to regain applause costs leverage. Strategic isolation is not withdrawal. It is refusing to buy connection with self-betrayal. Fewer friends does not mean less meaning. It means fewer compromises. Less applause does not mean less impact. It means less performance. The crowd applauds what reassures it, what keeps its emotional rhythm intact. When the applause fades, it often means you stopped feeding that rhythm. At first, the quiet feels heavy, because humans are wired to equate approval with safety. But Machiavellian clarity flips that instinct. Approval is cheap, alignment is rare. Distance creates space, and space creates strength. Without constant social feedback, you stop calibrating yourself to other people's reactions. Your internal compass sharpens. Decisions become cleaner because they are no longer filtered through the need to belong. You become harder to pull, harder to provoke, harder to manipulate, because you are no longer anchored to the crowd's mood. This is the advantage most people never reach, because they turn back the moment things get quiet. They confuse fewer voices with failure. They confuse separation with loss. But those who stay discover something stabilizing. You do not need the crowd once you understand it. You can still engage, but selectively, intentionally, on terms that do not require you to shrink. You are not lonely. You are simply no longer part of the crowd. And that distance is not a weakness. It is the strategic cost of seeing clearly in a world that runs on noise. Distance forces a decision, because once you stop blending in, you cannot keep moving the same way. You either retreat into isolation or you learn how to operate effectively among people without surrendering clarity. This is where Machiavellian strategy stops being theory and becomes survival. The first rule is restraint. Do not try to repair the crowd. Crowds do not want to be improved, they want to feel stable. The moment you try to correct them, you mark yourself as friction. Energy is wasted explaining to systems designed to absorb emotion, not insight. The second rule follows immediately. Never argue with feeling. Emotion does not negotiate, it reacts. When you confront emotion with logic, you escalate defensiveness instead of shifting behavior. You are not changing minds, you are triggering shields. The efficient response is either silence or redirection, depending on whether you hold leverage. The third rule ties everything together and changes how you move. Position always beats persuasion. People do not respond to how well you explain, they respond to where you stand. Once this clicks, you stop trying to win conversations and start shaping context. With the majority, you simplify, not because they are incapable, but because complexity has no return at scale. You speak in conclusions instead of process. You offer direction instead of justification. Short statements, clear boundaries, minimal explanation. This is not deception, it is compression. You are translating reality into a form that can actually land. Depth is reserved for the few who can carry it. Those people are rarely found in groups. They appear quietly, one interaction at a time. With them, you can slow down, explore nuance, refine ideas without armor. That separation is critical. Shallow language for reach, deep language for alignment. Most people fail because they invert this. They give nuance to crowds and sound bites to allies. Machiavellian thinking reverses the flow. Another shift happens when you stop proving yourself. Proof invites evaluation, and evaluation erodes position. The more you demonstrate, the more you place yourself on trial. Instead, you build placement. You choose where you show up. You choose when you speak. You allow ambiguity to create weight instead of anxiety. People respect what cannot be easily measured or challenged. This is why those with authority rarely explain everything they know. They let uncertainty do the work. You are not hiding truth. You are preventing dilution. Over time, reactions change, even if understanding does not. People may not grasp your reasoning, but they adjust their behavior. They pause before pushing. They check before dismissing. They factor you in. That is the real metric of influence. Machiavellian strategy is not about converting minds. It is about shaping responses. It accepts human behavior as it is and uses it efficiently. You stop resenting emotion and stop punishing yourself for seeing further. You work with incentives instead of against them. Speak simply where simplicity rules. Stay silent where silence carries power. Go deep only where depth is valued. Build position instead of chasing approval. You do not need agreement to move effectively. You need traction. And traction comes from understanding that you do not need them to understand you. You need them to respond correctly to where you stand. What this all resolves into is not hardness, and it is not contempt. It is realism without hostility. Machiavellian clarity is not about judging people. It is about removing illusion. You were never wrong for expecting reason, honesty, or depth. You were simply paying an emotional price for expecting those things in places where they were never going to exist. Pain did not come from seeing clearly. Pain came from hoping incorrectly. You hoped explanations would be rewarded. You hoped insight would be welcomed. You hoped understanding would be mutual. And every time reality contradicted that hope, it felt personal. Once you stop expecting the wrong outcomes, the emotional injury stops repeating itself. You no longer feel insulted when people react emotionally. You no longer feel dismissed when logic is ignored. You no longer feel the need to defend yourself in conversations that were never built to be fair. That shift is not cynicism. It is calibration. Machiavellian thinking does not ask you to despise human nature. It asks you to work with it as it is. When you accept people without fantasy, something stabilizes inside you. You speak less, but each word carries more weight. You engage selectively, not compulsively. You stop explaining your value and start occupying your position. Silence stops feeling like weakness. Distance stops feeling like loss. You realize that peace does not come from being understood. It comes from no longer fighting reality. Most people never reach this point because they confuse clarity with cruelty and restraint with arrogance. They keep bleeding energy, trying to be liked, validated, or agreed with. You are not obligated to convince everyone. You are not responsible for correcting the unwilling. You are not here to rescue the crowd from itself. You are here to move with accuracy. When you stop trying to fix people, you regain control of yourself. When you stop chasing understanding, you regain leverage. This is not withdrawal from life. It is engagement on your terms. You are no longer reacting to noise. You are choosing where your attention goes and where your silence does the work. That choice changes everything. Clarity is not cruelty, it's strategy. If you want more psychology, power, and real-world strategy, comment "ready" and subscribe. Most people won't. That's why it works.